Eric, I'm going to use three words that people don't understand. They use it, they're quite common, and they've almost reached the point of being platitudes when used in sentences. I'm going to use these three words, and then we could talk about them a little bit. Programming, periodization,
Mm.
love.
Absolutely.
No.
Yeah.
Guess which one we're going to talk about today?
Well, I'll tell you what, the way I feel about programming periodization, we're talking about all 3 every time we talk about the first two.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't. So, Eric, you are the man. I think. Were you the one that started this gangster shit? Okay. And I'm not going to finish that lyric. But were essentially the distinction that needs to be made between periodization and programming, where now they're kind of interchangeable. And sometimes when they enter the vernacular of just the average lifter, it's like, oh, it's interchangeable. Yeah. Programming, periodization. Yeah, I use both of them. And then there's kind of the men and women in the ivory tower, the gurus. They're like, yeah, you don't know a thing about periodization. So you kind of have these two camps. Like you have the individuals, free flowing, they use them interchangeably. And then you have the mystique of those that we could almost peer up at and can't. They're blinding in the luminosity. That they know periodization. So what is the kerfluffle here about programming, periodization, people using them together, and in fact if there is a difference?
Yeah, it's well, first I will say I'm actually not the one who started this gangsta shit. Our guest today, Mike Zourdos, he is he's the man behind the curtain. Okay. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's like if you the Wizard of Oz and you look behind the curtain and there's actually a more badass wizard. So it's quite different. And that badass wizard behind the curtain of the pretty badass wizard you thought was badass is actually Mike Zourdos. So when you hear many of the things coming out of my mouth, I'm often channeling Zourdos. For those who don't know, I met him in late 2013 at an RTS. Mike Tushir hosted conference in Sydney before I had officially gotten into the meat of my PhD. And Dr. Zourdos was one of my mentors. He was on my PhD advisory panel. And now we've been working together since then for 7 years, believe it or not. So because he is not has this dominant online profile, you will hear a lot of his teachings through his students, which I am one of. So yes, if you were to talk to many people about periodization, especially if we were to even dial it back to the early 2000s or the 90s, there would be a lot of posturing and names being thrown around, like Isherin, Bondarchuk, Franz Bosch is a newer one. It depends on like what sport you're in, where you came from. Are you a block periodization guy? Are you in the more modern one, which actually Zourdos was really unhappy with and unhappy about, was like, oh, the DUP, So for those who don't know, Dr. Zourdos did his PhD looking at different models of daily undulating periodization. And not long after some of that got popularized, and you heard Lane Norton talking about it, he had success with it, among others. People tried to do the same thing that was historically done with periodization, of putting it in a box, turning it into a thing, and positioning it as the best new dawn. As the sun rises, now we finally have the answer to periodization. Matt Viev was wrong. Block periodization was wrong. Mike Stone was wrong. No, now we have a new messiah. And I think even most of these individuals, those names I threw out, probably wish it wasn't viewed in this way, where it was dogmatic, only a specific way of doing it with rigid rules. And what we talk about today, and what I have talked about, I've liked to been a part of the zeitgeist, although I am not the one who started that zeitgeist gangsta shit, is to try to get people to look at periodization more conceptually. And that is something that I actually learned from Zourdos. He would always say, that what we get from research, especially in this area, is conceptual knowledge that you then integrate into something practical. And that's exactly what he did for us today and broke it down.
No. And I think this is a powerful episode. It's not a super long one, but Mike, when he revs up, he's considerate with his thoughts, where he wants to take a big picture look. And then he goes down kind of to the microcosmic, where it's like, this is actually how it's applicable. So it's like, here, I want you to think about these things. And so he fit right in with the whole Iron Culture ethos, where we talk about history, science, culture, and we talk about the philosophical underpinnings of a lot of what we discuss. So, man, without further ado, I'll just say I think it's a fantastic episode, and we will not wait a year before we have him back on. Eric, I wonder what it says about us. So the guest that we have before us is one of your partners, business partners in mass monthly applications and strength sports. He's the silent ninja assassin. He is the third part of the triumvirate, which now, I mean, there's another guy that was added. I can't remember his name, Eric. You know when people are just so forgettable that, and you don't even want to remember it. You know what I mean?
I'll help you out. It's Derek Trexler.
Honestly, it sounds like a made-up name. Like, he probably should consider an alias, but I don't want, brother, I don't want to go on a tangent because we have the third aspect of the triumvirate, and I don't know what it says about us, Eric, with the fact that we had Mike Zourdos on, Zourdon himself, in the very fourth episode of Iron Culture, talking about periodization, and he did a fantastic job. As you told me, off camera, you're like, he's one of the best presenters I know. He's a good friend. He's a hella smart guy. And so all these positive things, and then we waited an entire year to have him back on. So it's like, boom, got him in early. It's like, we got to have Mike Z on. And then we waited from episode 4 to like 65 to have him back on. What does that say about us, Eric?
It says we understand that Mike Zourdos is the sun, and we are Icarus. And if we get too close, there is a finite amount of Zourdos you can get in your life. And if by your life, I mean the internet.
Right.
And if by I mean Icarus, I mean Mike actually is a tenured professor with a kid and who doesn't like the internet that much. It's not really the Icarus thing. It's just that. Yeah. Then I think it holds up perfectly.
No, that made perfect sense. And I would just say that sometimes distance makes the heart grow fonder. And that's what I personally like to believe, because we are thrilled to have the one, the only Mike Zourdos back on the culture. And hey, Eric, I just love how we're real original, because last time we were speaking about periodization. Today, we're going to speak about something entirely different. Entirely different.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I thought we were talking about periodization on this one.
Oh, yeah, no. Yeah, it's very different, though, guys. Don't worry about it. It's
programming.
Programming.
Totally
That's
different.
the word.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. In fact, on that note, first off, for those who weren't on Iron Culture 60 episodes ago, Mike, can you introduce yourself a little bit? And then secondly, since we've been talking so long, I'll give you a second question, if you can remember it. Can you tell us the difference between periodization and programming after you introduce yourself?
I mean, I was content to listen to the back and forth there all day. It was great. Felt like none of it was planned out. Completely spur of the moment. So just, I don't know if you guys have maybe been taking an improv class together or something like that, but congratulations on your newfound skills. I thought Eric was going to say something like, "Oh no, Omar, we did have him on around episode 40. He's just so short you can't see him." In typical Helms jokes that he likes to make, but I'll make that before he can jab that one in later. So, quick introduction. I'll keep it short. I'll prefer to let my anything I have to say speak for itself. If you guys think the content is good, that is listening. But very briefly, I'm an associate professor at Florida Atlantic University in the Department of Exercise Science and Health Promotion. Direct our muscle physiology laboratory. We have 3 main focuses of the lab. One is to do resistance training studies, and on stuff we're going to talk about today: periodization, programming, autoregulation. The other is to look at resistance training to leverage a neuroprotective effect. Specifically, we look at the neurotrophin BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and how it responds to resistance training, along with looking at cathepsin B, which is a myokine that can cross the blood-brain barrier and interact with BDNF to improve neurogenesis and neuroprotection. And then the third focus is resistance training in clinical populations. And currently we're undergoing a trial at FAU, which has been suspended now due to COVID-19, if you're listening during this time, which looks at resistance training on health parameters in patients undergoing chemotherapy or radiation, some type of curative care. So those are 3 focuses of our lab. In addition to that, I work in Mass with Eric Trexler, and Greg Knuckles, and then there's speculation going on, and if Helms and Trexler are the same person. I can confirm that they are.
Okay.
So just so anybody can worry about that, the real guy is Eric Trexler. So it seems that that's who you have on the podcast here with you, Omar.
Yeah.
So if anybody has questions about that, you can contact me, and I probably won't respond to you. Otherwise, that's really mostly what I do, is involved in those two entities, and then just enjoy mentoring the students at FAU. And then to get into your question, so the difference between programming and periodization, Eric, was that where you started us off?
I'm mostly impressed in your memory, but yes, that was the question.
Well, I'm not 78 like you, so unlike
guys, folks, let's pause for a second, because I actually got to give a major compliment, Eric, to Mike Zourdos, where you told me this once again. When I say privately, I don't mean like it was said in confidence, but it's like, man, he's a really good presenter and he's a really funny guy. This is almost like, and Mike, I think you're going to appreciate this, because I know you play, if I remember from the 4th episode, guitar, right? No,
Omar. No. I have a guitar.
I
don't actually play the guitar.
Yeah.
I have a guitar that when I lived in Tallahassee, I traded a piece of furniture to him for a guitar that he had. Still one of the best bartering decisions I've ever made. So if somebody walks into my house and they ask me if I play, I don't lie. I say no. But if they walk in and they're like, sweet guitar, I'm just like, yeah, I know.
Wow. Well, I'm still going to go with it. It adds to your personality, because I'm going to make a reference then, and it was the assumption that you know the artist, and it doesn't matter. Extreme is the band, Nuno Bettencourt is the guitarist, Portuguese guitarist, fantastic, and they have Gary Sharon, who is the vocalist, and all this to say, Eric, very quickly, that the frontman is the guy that could sing the best, right? He's clearly the frontman, he's on vocals, there's a reason why he's the one singing, but in fact, the reality is quite different. When they did the duet More Than Words, which was written by Nuno Bettencourt, their number one biggest hit in general, Nuno is a phenomenal guitar player. His ear is perfect when it comes to singing, and he's actually a better singer. It's a duet. And so really, it's like, wait a second, you're this phenomenal musician, and also you're a better vocalist than the vocalist, but you just choose to sit in the background? What's up? I'm like, I feel like this is Mike Z kind of with Mass, where it's like, I don't give a shit about social media. I'm not going to be on here. You're going to have me on here. I'm going to be hella funny, but I really don't care about the response. If you want to contact me, you can't contact me. I'm going to disappear right now. Peace. So that's all.
You have Helms for that, right? So Helms can make sure my work gets seen. Or you can follow me at The Gardening Dietitian. I do great things. I have a flourishing garden where I post all of the tips and tricks where you can grow the garden to your best of your ability. So
that's the best part is Catherine, Mike's wife, not to put her on blast on the internet, is an RD, is also a professor, PhD RD. They could be the fit couple who knows all the things that they want.
Don't ever say that about that's. I'm insulted that you would.
They would be so good, but they will never do that because
it's my nightmare.
Not who they are. Exactly, I love it.
Yeah.
So it was great having you on. Thanks so much. No,
cool.
I'm just kidding. So,
I enjoyed it.
So tell us, we had you on last time. So for those who don't remember, we had John Kiley. The iconoclast of periodization. We had Mike Tuchscherer, one of the most, I would say, one of the most outlier coaches in powerlifting, a deep thinker, a paradigm shifter, and someone who has not even been in academia, but has had probably a large effect on it. And then we've also had yourself discuss periodization, and that was a very high-level discussion. It involved some really interesting analogies that we've discussed on Iron Culture since. But we didn't get into the X's and O's very much. So if you could kind of frame this conversation for us, what is the difference between periodization and programming?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really important question. People will misconstrue the two a lot, especially over the past decade or so when talking about periodization, and different forms or, quote, types of periodization have become more prominent. And just very briefly, when I use the word types of periodization, I use that now, but I'm sure we'll get into this later, fellas. Where there really aren't many different, quote, types, but that's a word that's used out there a lot. So I think it's an important question to distinguish. So to give straightforward definitions, I would say that periodization is the long-term trends in what you're doing. So the definition that I gave to you last time which, if I recall, is a definition that was given by Buford and colleagues maybe over a decade or so ago now in the literature, which is periodization is the manipulation of training variables to maximize performance at a specific time. So, and I think it's important to keep in mind that when periodization was first created, or we first started using it, this was way back when talked about Philostratus, the Athenian, that used 11-month kind of general blocks and then 1 month specific phases, or Olympic athletes for track and field, for swimming, things like this. So when I say that is think of, to understand what periodization is before we get into the definition of programming, think of an Olympic athlete and he or she is training for something 4 years from now. And you are structuring things over that time to peak at the national championships or the Olympic trials, and then at the Olympics, right? Where your performance is in between, even if it's not peaked, it's all part of the plan to get to where you want to be on that specific day. So the long-term trends over that 4 years of how your volume changes and how your intensity changes is periodization. You want to train to maximize your bench press 16 weeks from now. In all likelihood, over that 16 weeks, the volume that you do is going to go down. Just think of the number of sets or the number of reps. And the intensity that you use is going to go up. Programming is the short-term fluctuation, or in terms of lifting, the sets and reps that you are doing today or that you are doing this week. So if we say, in periodization dictates programming, because if we have that 16-week program to maximize your bench press, and just a simple, straightforward example. And we break this up into 4-week blocks. The first block might have the highest volume, the second block a little lower, third block a little lower, third block a little lower. Well, so let's take that first block, and that's our highest volume, right? And the blocks go down this way. So if we have that first block, we have our highest volume there. If periodization dictates programming, what does that mean? Well, if programming is how many reps are we doing today? Well, how many reps should you be doing when your volume is the highest? Most likely moderate to higher reps. So if you know your periodization structure, you can say, in general, during this time, I'm going to have higher volume. In general, during this time, I'm going to have lower volume. Then you might not know exactly, and you probably shouldn't, but in general, you'll know, well, hey, if I know I have the highest volume, generally my programming is going to be higher repetitions. In general, my programming is going to be lower intensity. In general, other programming strategies in a higher volume block may include rest pause or cluster sets or drop sets, because those things are programming strategies. They're not structures of periodization. They're just ways to program today. Rest pause is a way to program today. So if you're short on time and you want to equate for volume, and you typically have an hour to train and you only have 30 minutes, maybe today you use rest pause instead of normal training. That's a programming structure. Would you do that in the final week when you're trying to peak that bench press? You would not, because it would probably create too much damage, too many metabolic byproducts that could affect you. So that's a programming strategy that you would only use with this goal in mind during a higher volume stage. Thus, periodization dictates programming in that way. So periodization is the long-term trends. Programming is what sets and reps can I do today or this week that allow me to meet my periodization goals. And I guess that's to overarching answer that question at first before we get into more of it. I think I'll stop there for now if you have a follow-up. But that's kind of if that makes sense, how I would frame that discussion in general.
I think that's a really useful answer, to see that one kind of emerges from the second. A lot of the times in my experience in the S&C world, periodization, and this probably has more to do with some of the personalities that have been involved in periodization over the decades rather than the way it should be, or the way it actually may have been intended, that it seems like there is a very specific thing you need to be doing, that there's a specific target rep range at this time, and it feels much more top-down than rather emergent, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And it's almost like, shit, did I do that right? Let me go back to page 385 and see what Sif and Verkhochansky said to make sure I understand this right. So I think when you frame it that way, seeing programming as something that is a very practical, makes sense on what you're doing on the day, but still it adheres to the global concepts of what you're trying to do and get done 16 weeks, 20 weeks, a year from now, if it's the national championships or Olympics or what have you. I think that's something that's a lot more palatable and a little less intimidating, which I really appreciate the way you frame that. Now I've got a question for you. When we're talking to people who may or may not be competing, and I think for one, this represents some of our audience in all times. If someone is necessarily a very motivated and serious person who's may or may not be competing but who wants to get stronger or bigger, or if we're discussing someone who has extended off seasons, like it's very common among bodybuilding, especially if they're doing it in what I would say is a more sustainable way. They're competing every other year. And the goal isn't strength anyway, but more so strength is kind of I guess, keeping your finger on the pulse of your progress to ensure that you are actually hopefully getting bigger. What does this look like? If you don't know what date you're intended to peak on, then do you need to worry about periodization, or what is your focus now? And the other comment I said is every meet that I know is canceled in the near future. So when you're in a holding pattern, even as you are somebody, let's say you are a competitive powerlifter, or you're a competitive Olympic weightlifter, right now there may not even be a meet for you to do in 2020, depending on where you live in the world. What do you do when there is no periodization general concept? Like if this is if programming emerges from periodization, and you are someone either by definition or by circumstance now who doesn't have a periodization strategy, what does your training look like?
Cool. I'm just jotting down a bunch of things here while you're saying that. Okay. So the first thing I want to address maybe the bodybuilding aspect of it that you threw out there. And so before we talk about programming in a bodybuilding sense and putting that together a little bit, let's go back to the term periodization, because as you alluded to and at the start of your comments, there's a lot of misconceptions about this, and the old guard has a lot of takes on periodization. I wrote this in a Mass article. I think that's either coming out. I think that's coming out on May 1st, Eric. Yeah, and the old guard's going to find me and probably beat me up. They're going to be waiting in the parking lot for me. Just like they're still waiting for Shooter McGavin out there. But the old guard holds the definitions of periodization a little too close to them. And so, Eric, I've seen you give presentations entitled Nutritional Periodization. So what that should signal to anybody who's listening here is that periodization is kind of a word that's, been co-opted, if you will, by resistance training enthusiasts or by powerlifters or those that wrote these old textbooks. In that periodization, if we say manipulation of training variables to maximize performance at a specific time, well, just take that to anything. Manipulation of what training variables? Nobody mentioned volume. Nobody mentioned intensity. Nobody mentioned frequency. You can periodize your frequency. You can periodize the exercises that you use. You can periodize almost anything. So we show these old figures that say, hey, volume goes down and intensity goes up. And while that's the most common trends of the way to do things, if you're peaking for strength specifically, or really if you're an endurance runner peaking for a race, or a swimmer peaking for a race, that's when this concept was started. That's kind of the more appropriate way to look at it. So periodization can mean anything. So if you're a bodybuilder, programming really becomes more at the forefront of what you're doing. And I like to look at this, and Eric, you're probably, and Omar as well, better at this than I am in terms of, you've certainly lived this life and coached more people in that way than I have. But I would look at this and having, the main tenets of training that you look for each week, or that you want to ideally meet. And so what are those tenets? So for muscle growth, you're looking at mechanical tension, and the way you're going to get there is through a sufficient amount of training volume. Now, what is that amount of training volume that you need? I don't know. I can't really give you a number, and I think it's irresponsible to give people an exact number, especially an average number, because it's so individual in what someone needs. Are you training? Are you growing? Yes, you're probably good. Should you increase your volume? You can, but you don't have to. When should you increase it? When you stop growing. I know that's general, and sometimes it's too general, but I think it is good advice. But let's just say that you find that 15 sets on a muscle group per week is kind of what works for you. And again, that's also subjective because people count what counts as a set for a muscle group in different ways. So I think when I count sets for myself, just for anybody out there listening, and I know I'm going off, I only count direct sets. And so I realize that if I'm doing a row, this is working my biceps. But I don't count it for biceps, and it doesn't really matter because that might mean I only have that I did 8 sets of biceps this week instead of the 20 if I would have counted the row. But as long as I'm consistent and I progress from 8 sets to 12 sets, it's actually, for me, I can see that I'm progressing these direct sets, and it's a little easier to configure. So as long as you're consistent with it, I think that's fine. But anyways, I would keep these tenets of training. So you have sufficient volume, yes. All right, I want to get 15 sets in. How do I accomplish that? Well, I try to keep these main things in mind where I say, all right, if I want to get 15 sets a week, I'm going to try to get 10 of them through this compound movement for my quads through squatting, let's say. All right, not that you have to do that, just as an example. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So now I need to get 10 sets of squats. Well, I'm going to need to do that at least over 2 days. Doing that in one day, I know that too many sets in a day isn't a good idea. The quality of my work will diminish if I keep training. Another way to do this, if I need to do it over 2 days, I can't create too much fatigue in one day because I know that if I'm training to failure too much, my fatigue is going to linger into the other days. Right? Now, if I'm progressing and I need to now go to 15 sets of squats per week, I'm probably going to want to spread that over 3 days just for feasibility. So when I say these tenets of training, you meet your sufficient volume. You have that sufficient volume by splitting it up to not do too many sets on an exercise, let's say, per day. Once you're getting over 5 sets on an exercise, if you're not using like a cluster set or rest pause, that's probably too many for the most part. Then staying shy of failure for the most part to allow for better recovery to meet that. And you can use RPE, you can use velocity for that, whatever it is, something that's generally going to give you that you're not at failure. And if you do those things for hypertrophy, you're going to be in pretty good shape as long as you're having a well-rounded, balance of exercises that you're using. And I think that hypertrophy training is much more forgiving than training for strength in a lot of ways. In that if you don't have access to a squat rack, so what? Right? Like if you like squatting and that's what you use for muscle growth, certainly you don't want to have to go a year without squatting. But if you're traveling and the gym that you have access to in the hotel, has dumbbells up to 50 pounds and a leg curl and a leg extension, you're good for 2 weeks. It's not as big of a deal as if you're training for strength and you got a meet coming up and you have to travel, and then you got to find a gym an hour out of your way to drive to because you literally have to squat or you're not going to perform as well at the competition. So I think hypertrophy training is much more forgiving. So I keep those programming tenets in mind, and I know I'm getting off track a little bit, but I keep those main programming tenets in mind. And if you're running out of time and you're short on time for hypertrophy training, and let's say you wanted to get in 5 sets of 8 on the squat at 100 kilos, you can generally do all those sets and finish them at about an 8 RPE or less, or a 9 RPE or less, which is probably your goal, so you're not going to failure. But you have an hour to train, now you only have 30 minutes. Well, now you can go in, you can do your first set at the 100 kilos, shorten your rest intervals to 1 minute, drop the load to maybe 85 kilos, add 2 or 3 sets. You'll be done in a shorter amount of time. Your volume is the same. And as far as we know in the literature, your hypertrophy adaptations are going to be the same. And if strength does contribute some to hypertrophy, then this isn't hypertrophy to strength, but rather strength to hypertrophy. By being stronger, you can lift more. I don't think that's a very firm statement we can make. But let's just say it is part of it. By keeping your first set at 100 kilos in that case and dropping the rest to 85, your peak intensity is just as high and your strength should be pretty good for the most part. So by meeting all of those tenets of training, you have much more forgiving nature with hypertrophy training than with strength training. And then when we get into periodization, remember, periodization, one of the components of those variables can be volume. Well, periodization in terms of decreasing volume over time doesn't make a whole lot of sense for muscle growth. Because when those models are created, so if you look, there's a systematic review that's out there, and when it came out, it was like 7 or 8 studies that were included. I don't know, Eric, if you can remember, on periodization for hypertrophy. And it said that...
Gurgic,
yeah. And it said that periodization just isn't important for hypertrophy. And I agree that based upon the data that exists in the literature, periodization is not important for hypertrophy. But almost all of those studies, there were two things about them. They were all designed to peak strength. They weren't designed to look at hypertrophy. And two, a lot of them were on untrained individuals, which we know things just aren't going to matter as much. You can do almost anything and be able to make progress. So if you're designing something to peak strength, the volume is going to go down and intensity is going to go up. And so if you have this over 12 weeks and you're testing muscle thickness, let's say ultrasound, pre and post, and at the end of that study, you test muscle thickness, but your intensity is really high and your volume is really, really low, how are you peaking hypertrophy at that time? You're not. It's not designed for that. So I think when we think of periodization for hypertrophy, in the quintessential normal sense, if you will, it doesn't matter. But in the sense that we know that you need to be progressing volume or probably over time, it's a good idea. You know, Eric, there's a study we reviewed for mass from an author named Brigado not too long ago. Mm-hmm. And I think it went up to a 16-set group, a 24-set group, and a 32-set group over something like 8 weeks, looking at if volume, there was a dose-response relationship with hypertrophy and volume, and it found that there was. And one of the things we talked about in that review, and I think it's important here, is that while 32 sets, and again, as I said at the outset, I don't want to give anybody, hey, you should do 32 sets of volume. Your volume needs to be individualized to you. But just as a concept, if that's better than 24 sets, meaning more is better in this study, then we need to think of that in the way that it's impossible, or at least practically impossible, to maintain 32 sets on every muscle group all of the time. So it probably makes sense to cycle volume. If you're cycling volume and doing a block of 8-10 weeks with 30 sets of volume on one muscle group, that means, or let's say on upper body, and then your lower body is going to be maybe 15 sets or 10 sets during that time. And then the next block, you're flip-flopping it and doing higher volume on the lower body and lower volume on the upper body. Is that not periodization? Did you not just periodize your volume? So in my opinion, I would say yes. In an opinion, not necessarily in the literature, yes, periodization does matter for hypertrophy, but we're really not at all talking about periodization, how it's discussed in the textbooks, how we're mostly talking about it. Not that that's wrong, it's not. It just doesn't apply in this context, right? And through that, if you're doing 32 sets of volume on a muscle group, you're probably going to need to split that up over 3 days a week of training. If you're only doing 10, so let's say you're doing that on the chest and the triceps, but at the same time you're doing that, you're only doing 10 sets for your quads, you can probably get that over 2 days a week, which is probably a good idea to facilitate the 3 sets on the other muscle groups. Then when you flip-flop and you go to high volume on the lower body and lower volume on the upper body, you're now probably doing 3 days a week frequency on the lower body. So you've also periodized your frequency. So to give the most long-winded answer ever to the original question that you asked, Eric, is that programming in bodybuilding probably takes the forefront. If you're using sufficient volume that is sufficient for yourself to grow, and you're staying shy of failure for the most part, not all the time, but for the most part on the main lifts, and you're meeting those criterion, you're going to be in good shape. However, when you progress over time, that's when, quote, periodization comes into play. And this is more about progressing volume and frequency in terms of cycling them throughout different muscle groups and increasing volume over time and then pulling it back at times because we know we can't really increase it forever. So that's more the periodization concept for hypertrophy. So programming really comes first in that strategy. Does periodization matter for hypertrophy? Yes, I believe so, but not at all in the context of most people think about. And so I would challenge everybody when they think about periodization to stop only thinking about the general term in the straight lines, volume goes down, intensity goes up. That has its place, but not for bodybuilding.
Eric.
I love it.
Yeah, I got to be honest, Mike, something I don't like about you?
What's up?
You're not dogmatic. And Eric, I don't know if I can trust anyone who's not willing to die on the cross for sets of 5. I just don't appreciate rational individuals that are willing to take a big picture look. Because sure, we could say right now, Mike, you're demystifying a lot of these concepts, right? Where, some of those old strength coaches, it almost was a badge of honor where they would throw around that phrase. And as you said, it's kind of nebulous now where it's used. Eric had a presentation when it comes to nutritional periodization. So it changes kind of what it means. But in reality, it seemed like before, especially not taking into account things like Mike Teixeira would say, the biopsychosocial model, that it was this mystique behind the word periodization. Oh, you need to read these Russian authors. And then we go back and we discover that, wait a second, this is like a lost in translation moment where it's a, broken telephone of a broken telephone of a broken telephone. You actually don't know shit. This isn't based upon anything in actuality, but it's a certain rigidity potentially of some of the old thoughts of periodization. And I liked what Mike Teixeira said, where he said the concept that, we're here, we're in a cave. He gave the most existential analogy. We've said it like a million times, Eric and myself, in Iron Culture. And so the plan that we have is kind of the map. We really don't know what the cave looks like, but the confidence that it provides us, the feedback that we get with our little light pen, which is all the biopsycho-social feedback, and that the rocks on the ground, they're constantly changing, that at least we have something, and that instills a sense of confidence. And you answered it in the context of what Eric said as it relates to hypertrophy, which I really liked. So there's a lot of demystifying of some of these concepts to make them conversational, which is really cool. Then people can conceptualize it in their head. I'm going to slightly change or frame the question that Eric asked, just because I know for myself, I know for Eric, I know probably for you, man, actually, I know you competed in powerlifting, that none of us are pure enthusiasts. So none of us are just hypertrophy boys or powerlifting lads. We it's a mixed bag. Like if we're lifting for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, there comes a time and place where we want to get stronger, where kind of what Eric said, our finger on the pulse of progress, we use strength as one of those markers. Is there then utility for, let's say, the generalists, which I'm trying to neatly define some of the iron culture enthusiasts, and I think most people writ large when it comes to lifting, they want to get bigger, they want to get stronger, they also don't want to be extremely overweight, and so they're juggling all these variables in their head at any one time. What is some of the utility then for, let's say, the generalist when it comes to periodization?
Yeah, so that's actually a question I'm really excited to answer. Before I get to that, though, there's a couple words that lately I've been trying to use more in my vocabulary, and you just used one of them, which is lads. Yeah. And so my wife and I, we like to watch a lot of old murder mystery TV shows. Yep. And they say things like this a lot, like the detective will say, hey, constable, go get the lads together. And I just want to use that. Like another one, my friend Ty, he uses the word jabroni a lot to describe people. And like, when he says that, I'm like, man, I wish I used that word more. So I think I'm going to start referring to my students as jabronis most of the time when they don't do something that I ask. They'll just refer back to me, and they'll probably say, hey, maybe you should shut up. I'm the one working over here, which that's fair. But lads is one of those words. So thank you, Omar.
Anytime.
So I'm excited to answer the question about enthusiasts. The reason being is this is what I would consider myself. I haven't competed in powerlifting in 7 years, and I don't plan to. And so, however, the last 2 years, I would say I've had a lot of fun lifting weights, and I've had way more fun than I did in a long time. I stopped trying to force myself to do things or train a certain way that I felt I should, and I was a terrible coach for myself. I wasn't being very objective. I had clients that I would coach, and their progress was great. I certainly have made mistakes as a coach too. So I'm not trying to sound like I did such a great job coaching these people. They work so hard. But the point being, I felt like I was doing a much better job for others than for myself, and thank God, right? I'm glad that I did that. But I just started to enjoy it much more when I trained like an enthusiast, and I felt I had a lot more revelations about what kind of was appropriate to do in training, but more so that and what I deemed appropriate became much more wide-ranging than what I deemed appropriate before. So you said, Omar, that I wasn't very dogmatic. I'm sure when I met Eric in 2013, I probably was. And I think I've gotten better about that, and I probably still have a long way to go. But so to answer the question in terms of the enthusiast, I think that some general thoughts for the enthusiast first, because I believe I am this now and have been for a little while. is your training is much more forgiving than you think it is. If you're going to sit down and write a program and you're going to take in all of these ideas, which is awesome. You should. But you're going to think, all right, I want to use this block periodization model and this undulating periodization model. I've heard it's probably good to train 3 times a week on this. And then I know that I can progress using RPE, but I could also progress based upon my AMRAP set or my plus set. I could also do rest pause on my assistance work. So let me write this program and try to incorporate every single piece of information into this program. And by trying to do everything, you literally do nothing. And you handcuff yourself so much. And I did this for a long time. And you sit there and you go into sleep and you're thinking about writing your next training block and you're doing all these things. And, if I just do this, this, and this, and then you get 2-3 weeks into a block and it's going okay, but you know what? I heard this today, and he or she was talking about progressing in this way, so I'm going to start adding that in next week. Stop. Just do what you wrote. It's fine. Does it have progressive overload? Are you doing the main lifts? Are you training a couple times a week? Yes. You're good. Do it. You're making progress? Do it. So for the enthusiast, that's my biggest piece of advice in all this is you have something, it makes pretty good sense. It's based in general upon the science. It's congruent with the practical considerations in reality. Put it down on paper, put your head down, and get to work. And then when that block is over, try something else if you want. But stop messing around with everything at one time. I know I made this error a lot myself. So in terms of specific applications for this, in terms of periodization, I think that keeping the mindset of not trying to do everything at once is where I'd like to start. Because if you have a certain progression model or a certain muscle group that you would like to train and progress, focus on that. And you can't focus on everything at one time. So you might decide that you need to prioritize lower body and you need to prioritize squatting and deadlifting. And you do that, you add some volume on that, you increase that from 2 days a week to 3 days a week in the amount that you're training it. So when you do that, don't increase or change anything else. If anything, decrease everything else. It's always harder than you think because you put this down on paper and you think, I can manage this. I can do this. And then you make it 2 days into the training block and like, Jesus, this is not going to work. This is a disaster, right? So stop trying to do too much when you think about all of these concepts. Pick 1 or 2 things. Maybe you get a little bit more aggressive on how those are trained. You pull everything else back. And then just like we talked about with periodization for hypertrophy, the next block, you start to prioritize something else. So if you're just an enthusiast and you're training in general to get bigger, to get stronger, it probably makes sense, the more I think about it in my eyes, is that over time, you're prioritizing something here or there at a specific time to say, hey, now I'm going to run this little bit higher volume bench program and pull back on everything else. It's probably not going to beat you up as much. You're going to be more likely to be successful in that bench endeavor over those next few months than you are if you're trying to crush everything at one time. One of the things that I think could help too is over the past year, when I really started to embrace that I was, and I didn't really use the term enthusiast, but now that you say it, Omar, it rings true. I started to embrace full body training. And, I'm getting off the periodization paradigm a little bit, but I think this is a little bit more helpful for the enthusiast because it doesn't always make sense to get too caught up in these other factors because you want to enjoy it. And I just think if you can enjoy it, you're going to be so much happier in what you're doing. At least I was. But full body training, one, it feels awesome. Like you feel great when you're squatting or benching in the same day or whatever it is. You're hitting all the muscle groups. But through this to me makes it really easy to periodize those concepts because you can't maintain 5 days a week training 30 sets on each muscle group. But training more frequently does make it easier to get higher volume on 1 or 2 muscle groups. And then you can still put the rest of them in. The reason I really enjoy it too is if let's say you're traveling and you have something to do and you've trained full body 2 or 3 days in a row, and then due to your schedule, you have to miss 2 days of training, you're not really worried or feeling like, oh man, I haven't trained legs in forever, I haven't trained bench in forever, because you just train them Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So what if you have to take Thursday, Friday off? You're back at it on Saturday, and it's still only been 72 hours since you trained that muscle group. So I see the utility of that for an enthusiast is really high. Now, obviously, not everybody can do that. So understanding, of course, if you're listening to this, you have time considerations, you like to split up the muscle groups, and certainly you should. But that's another aspect of periodization, right? Sometimes you might be training full body. Sometimes you might be on a split routine. What did you do? You periodize the type of routine or the way that your training is structured. So that's also periodization. So for the enthusiast, there's so many ways that you can get periodization in there. Then for the enthusiast, that enthusiast might pick a goal, right? So if you're an enthusiast, let's just use this term very generally, in that you're interested in kind of like you said, hypertrophy and strength, probably playing other sports, maybe playing in a pickup basketball league, in a soccer league, something like that. If you're Helms, you're not. From what I hear, the students over there try to get him to play real sports, and he doesn't. But I'm working on Colby. He's going to get you. He's going to get you one of these days.
Colby, I will appreciate the challenge, but it will continue to be a challenge.
He's gonna get you one day, but he's too nice. You can't say no to him. And so
I've done it so far.
So you might pick a goal as an enthusiast, and even if you're interested in all facets of getting bigger and stronger, and you might say, hey, I watched this video and this person squatted 500, and that's kind of a milestone squat, a 500-pound squat. I want to do that, right? Used to be pretty impressive in the world of powerlifting, not so much anymore, but if you could squat 500 pounds, you're pretty damn strong, right? So they might want to do this, but that's going to take some training. They're currently at 405, and they want to train for that. Well, during that time, they're going to periodize things strength-wise for that squat. They're going to say, hey, I'm going to look into this, and now perhaps I can get into a little bit from what maybe the intention of this was. I'm not sure, not to speak for you guys. But now they might say, all right, I'm going to use an integrated model of periodization. I know that volume goes down and intensity goes up over time, but for the squat or for my lower body specifically, for this next year, I want to go from 400 to 500. I know that I can do this. So I'm going to build my volume up with an intro cycle to talk periodization terms. Then in these first couple blocks of training, I'm going to do some higher volume with higher repetitions, more sets. Remember, periodization dictates programming. So in the higher volume, you're going to have higher repetitions like we talked about earlier. Use those other programming strategies in there. And I'm going to periodize down the volume over time, and I'm going to increase the intensity. And if it's the course of a year, that might actually be, you might actually try to peak after 6 months and then peak again after a year. You're not going to constantly be decreasing volume for the course of a year, most likely. But during that time, you're going to probably be doing more of a bodybuilding style stuff, let's say on your bench press. If you're not a powerlifter, you just want to squat 500. So on the upper body movements, you're going to train 2 to 3 days a week probably. You're going to have some times where, let's say, you have a few more sets on chest and triceps, and then your biceps and back are a little bit lower. Then sometimes where your back and biceps are a little bit higher and your chest and triceps are a little bit lower. Periodizing those movements in terms of bodybuilding volume cycling, but the squat is going to be your textbook definition of periodization. So in periodization, you don't have to periodize everything even in the same manner. If you're an enthusiast, you might decide as an enthusiast that now your goal is more physique oriented, and you want to get bigger. And so in terms of physique-oriented goals, you're going to go through, volume cycling, and maybe legs are a very strong point of yours, and you want to bring up your upper body. And so you're going to periodize volume cycling in terms of your upper body, but legs are going to stay at a lower set point where you can kind of maintain a little bit during that time while you're prioritizing upper body. So the enthusiast might have a myriad of different goals, and that's kind of the beauty of that too. Is you can have different goals for different muscle groups or different lifts at different times, and you can meet them all. An enthusiast might have, I have somebody that I started working with, and his goal over the long term is we want to squat 405 for 20. And so we're going to periodize things to squat 405 for 20. He's an enthusiast. Are we going to decrease volume and increase intensity? No. Right. By the way, you talked about old textbooks earlier. People always say, what textbooks should you read? Super training. How many of these people have actually read Super Training? Right, they just took a picture of it on a bookshelf, and super training. What's your favorite part? I got to go right now. I'm super busy. I'll come back later. Right? Nobody's actually. I mean, some have read it, but people that say this, nobody's actually read this. So, I think for the enthusiasts, it fits in. The cool thing is that every aspect of periodization can fit for the enthusiast. It's just what time are they going to use it, and what goals do they have at that specific point in time? Those goals can change. Those goals will change. If they're enjoying it, they're having fun, and they have the freedom to change. So your training is a bit more forgiving if you're an enthusiast. Don't get stressed over missing a session, or, I used to get stressed if I travel somewhere and I didn't have the equipment I want. Damn, I got to drive an hour to go to this gym, right? Ideally that's cool. Right? And I would do it to go to a fun place, but you don't have to stress over that. Whatever equipment you have, you can generally make work for a couple days at a time. If you're an enthusiast, your goals can change. You can periodize something for strength for one thing, while you can periodize something for hypertrophy, which means more of the volume cycling manner on those lifts at that time. So I think the enthusiast can incorporate all of these things. So it's really important still to understand the principles, but also keep in mind too that your training is more forgiving, and you don't have to program every single progression scheme in every block that you ever do. It's probably, if you have the basics down and you just want to get bigger and stronger, you're good, man. Right? Sometimes don't overthink it. So again, another long-winded answer that gives some specifics, but then tells you, hey, kind of do what you want. But and if it sounds like at times, and I mean this in a serious sense, oh wow, like these just sound like general concepts. Maybe he doesn't know everything you should do, or maybe nobody out there really knows. It's because nobody does know. Like on programming, we are all guessing a little bit, everyone. And, I always say for an individual, the best coach for an individual, if they've been having success, is the person that's already been coaching them. Because they know what that individual responds to, how much volume they can handle. Eric, if I took over one of your clients, I don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. If you took over one of my clients, you wouldn't know. You'd have to ask me a bunch of questions. I'd have to ask you a bunch of questions. They would be starting at such a deficit by going from you to me, because I'd have to learn everything, not to mention their mental makeup as well. So if you're an enthusiast, I think that all those things can apply. And then I guess the last thing before I shut up and we finally move on is that keep your mind open, and keep in mind that you can willingly switch from one theory of training to another theory of training, over a long term, over a 6 months or a year, and that's okay, right? But try not to do it within the same training block, right? If you write something down, do it. Stay with it. If it has the basic tenets, you'll be fine. A year later, you might decide, and don't be afraid to say, hey, I've been listening. I listened to this podcast, and you tried what we're talking about here. But I then listened to some RTS stuff, or some SSPT stuff, or whatever it might be, or some strength athlete stuff, and you enjoyed it. Do it. You have the freedom to do that, and that's a fun thing. What this is about, if you're an enthusiast and you train for 20, 30 years, it's about having fun. It's about learning about yourself. It's about using training to help your other the other priorities in your life. I'm a big believer that doing one thing helps you in other aspects. So, use it in that way and have some fun is my best advice as you apply the concepts.
Mike, I love it. There's a lot of gems in there. So I think first you gave people a very practical construct of how they can apply different programming and periodization strategies when they have multiple goals, which was the question. But interweaved in there was some wisdom that I really appreciated, because I would have been the guy in, let's say, 2000, maybe 7, 8, or 9, who would have tuned out of this podcast and purposely sought out someone who was much more definitive in their answer and who could tell me this would be optimal, and I would listen to them, and it would be to my own detriment. Because only now do I know that really what science is really what study is and really what knowledge is at its basic ideology, that we can only know so much, that it is highly individualized. There are not concrete answers to these things. And even if they were, they change fluidly because we're humans. So by finding someone who would confidently tell me what the answer was, I've only successfully found someone trying to sell me something or a fool. And I'm actually worse off than I would have been if I had just kind of sat with this existential crisis of finding out that there is no such thing as optimal for me right now that I can know forever. And instead tried some things. The other piece of advice that would have really fell on deaf ears when I was younger, unfortunately, but I think is really, really important for people to listen to now, is the idea that you might be doing something right now that is suboptimal. And if you could magically know that, you shouldn't just hop off the program, because A, you can't magically know that, but B, only by going through it do you learn something. And then that becomes an accumulated piece of knowledge that can then inform your future programming, and you actually get better over time, instead of being fearful or overly hopeful and looking for grass is greener, or reading something about what you're currently doing and hopping off it and actually never learning anything. So just two really big nuggets of wisdom there that I really appreciate that you shared, along with the practical stuff. So one piece that I did want to cover, because we've talked about people with hypertrophy goals, bodybuilders. We've talked about the enthusiast, someone who has a more generalist type of goal. Let's talk about powerlifters, or let's say Olympic weightlifters, or a strength athlete who does not have a competition on the horizon. I've met a number of athletes like this who they really feel a little bit lost when they don't have a targeted meet, because they understand training only through the lens of peaking for a specific time. So let's say you are a powerlifter. Let's say you've got a home gym, to make this really practical right now, because I know many do. But every competition has either been delayed by years or even canceled, or let's say you're not competing at one of these international meets that's been rescheduled. You just don't have a meet now. What might that look like? What type of programming and periodization concepts would be utilitous for this individual?
So you did actually ask that last time as I'm looking at my notes, and through my rambling, I never answered it. So you were very nice to ask it again instead of saying, hey, Zourdos, can you answer my question that I asked you 20 minutes ago? So I think the first thing, and this is going to vary person to person, but I think the first thing is your meet's been canceled or postponed. Is it just canceled? Is it happening again next year? And if that's the case, and your next year, let's say your 2021 is planned to already be the same as your 2020, I would just train like normal and do the meet in my garage. I would just keep going. Say, all right, I have this structure. This is what I had already set forth as my plan to, and if you're doing that theoretically, that's the best strategy forward for you. You've decided that's your best strategy forward. So I would just do it, right? However, even if you've planned that that's the best strategy forward for you, mentally, it might not always be. For me, I wouldn't really care. As a selfish point, I don't enjoy powerlifting meets anyways. Right? It takes up the whole day. I have to go. I have to be around other people. You know how I feel about other people, Eric. Right? So I can go out to my garage. I can do the whole thing in 2 hours and I'm done. Right? So for me, I'd be like, this is great, right? I can just do this. But maybe you don't want to, just test by yourself or train. So even if it's theoretically good, you might not want to do it, which is certainly valid. So now let's give a different example. Let's say that, as we're recording this here, it's April 2020. Let's say, you were going to go to IPF Classic Worlds coming up in June, I believe it was. So I had a lifter, or have a lifter. He was going to be competing, but he's not obviously now. And so let's say that was going to be in June, and you're not sure, maybe your nationals is early in the fall, and you're not sure if that's going to take place, right? And so now you have to kind of plan to say, all right, I need to get ready. And most likely, let's say Worlds in June 2021 is going to happen. So that's the next big thing that you feel confident about that you're getting ready for. So I say, all right, now, where am I now? I don't want to necessarily waste my time peaking there, because once you peak, then your strength kind of dips afterwards. It's some struggle to get back. I don't want to go through all of that. I want to have this long-term success. What I would probably do in this case is definitely stop short of peak. and keep myself in a kind of healthier mindset mentality. I'm enjoying training because I now know that I have over a year of training before I have, let's say, something on the books. So I'm in this situation. I'm going to start to try objectively look at myself. Say, all right, I compete 3 times a year. I got a regional meet, I got a national meet, I got worlds if I'm at this top level. What do I need to work on that I don't necessarily get to work on? Because I'm always going from meet to meet. And I say, all right, well, I get my bench in good enough shape so I can put up a decent total, but I know that I can do better on it. And I never really prioritize it for the long haul, because when I do, I know that my squat dips, but I don't have enough time meet to meet to get the squat up to where I want or the deadlift up to where I want. This is a perfect opportunity to now run that bench press cycle, to run that overreaching cycle. So in this case, let's say, just to, now since we've been talking conceptual, let's give some specifics. Let's say you squat and bench 3 times a week, and you're doing 15 to 20 sets on each. And for deadlift, you're deadlifting twice a week, doing about 10 sets on each. Let's say now you back off your squat, you start squatting twice a week, and you do this for about 10 sets. You go down from 15 to 20 to 10, and you keep the deadlifting about where it is on the squat days, because that shouldn't be too difficult to maintain. You take the bench press from that 15 sets 3 days a week, and you start bumping it up to 20 sets 3 days a week for 4 weeks. After that, you go about 4 to 6 weeks where you bump it up to 4 days per week, and you start bumping up to maybe 20, 25 sets. After that, you do your last, let's say, bench press cycle, that's 4 weeks, and you start maxing 3 to 4 times a week. You do something like that really peaks your bench press. Maybe you go from, you're a 80 kilo, lifting around 83 kilos, and you're bench pressing around 140 kilos, respectable, but not amazing. And that puts your bench press up to around 165, not unreasonable. Now it's all of a sudden pretty good. You did the other work on the squat. You were squatting maybe 250, which is, for an 83 kilo lifter, pretty good, pretty solid. You were able to maintain the squat around 250, even if it dipped to 245, no big deal. After you went through that time from now, you're now at the end of the summer. Worlds is coming up again in June. You still have so much time to get that together. Afterwards, you take the bench press back to more normal loads a little bit. You can start to increase the volume and intensity on the squat and deadlift, which is probably going to cause that to go up pretty quickly, bring them back to normal levels. And there you have it. You focused on one lift for a time. So I wanted to give that because I think it's a little bit more specific. There's really endless answers to the question in terms of how you can go about it and what's right for what person at what time and their mental makeup and what they can deal with. But if you have that, my first thing, I guess, is you have all of this time. What is it that you don't get to normally work on, but you need to work on? In this case, in that example, it's that person's bench press. That's, a couple months of training. To recap how that would go about if you're doing that, because we say, right, also another concept that's interweaved within periodization would be, let's say, overreaching or higher volume cycles. But it's typically not advisable to just immediately jump from your normal training into that. You kind of want to build up to it. So in this case, this actually is a microcosm of everything we've already talked about. And so you have all of your main lifts for that power lifter at normal levels. You pull 1 or 2 of them back, in this case, the squat or the deadlift. And for the bench press, for that first block, if you notice, we just increased things a little bit from maybe, 15 sets up to 20 or so. And then in the second block, we changed one more thing, which was frequency, up from 3 days to 4 days. And then the block after that, we started maxing 3 or 4 times a week. So what did we do in terms of periodization for the bench press there? Well, we gradually increase things, which is that intro, if you will. So if you think of periodization, typically we have this volume that goes down, and we're just talking about the powerlifter strength periodization for a moment. This volume that goes down. But even that is a misnomer, aside from the fact that it's really looking more like this wave pattern. But really, this peak, what that's saying is that, and I'll get back to the bench press example in a second, so bear with me. This goes down like this. It's saying, okay, this is over. You go back here. And you start again, right? No way. You go back here, and this was that top volume, and then what do? You gradually build up this volume before it starts going down again. So in that bench press example, we had squat and bench press and deadlift at their normal levels. We have this year without competing. What do we need to work on? We need to work on the bench press. We typically don't get to do it that much during the year with all these competitions. we just decrease the squat and deadlift to a level where we think we can maintain. If you lose 5 kilos over 3 months, don't worry about it. You got 9 months to gain that back and more. Then for the bench press, we increase volume just a little bit in the first block. Then in the second block of overreaching, we increase volume and frequency. Now we're up higher. And then in the last block, we decrease volume. All of this is typical periodization. We decrease volume and we increase the intensity to maxing levels. So if you're familiar with daily max programming, Omar, I know that you are. If you're familiar with daily max programming, what is that? It's a programming strategy that fits into an overall periodized macro cycle, if you will. So in that time, I'd ask myself, again, the endless answers, what do I need to work on that I don't? In this case, it's the bench press. Not a lie for me, it's always the bench press. And then you gradually build up volume. You get to a block where you're peaking volume, and then that volume's going to go down. But when you do, the intensity goes up. And we talked about incorporating periodization frequency into that, periodizing set or rep volume into that, and then even periodizing and programming strategies like daily 1RM or frequent 1RM training, I should say. And if periodization dictates programming, where did we put the daily or the frequent maxing strategy? At the end of the periodization cycle where intensity is high and volume is low, because that's a programming strategy. So again, periodization dictates programming. That's just one example of how I could do that. After that, you pull back. Everything probably goes to maintenance a little bit. If you wanted to do something after that for the squat or the deadlift, I wouldn't jump into it right away. I would probably take a month or so, kind of chill out, do some more normal training, and then put the squat up there. Just mentally, you need a break from that. So you don't have a training for a year. What do you need to work on? Devise a scheme, focus on that, and you incorporate all the elements of periodization that we already talked about.
I love it. I think it very much kind of echoes what you were saying about the bodybuilder. You know, the bodybuilder is one who the goal of hypertrophy is kind of this, it's the entire body. And you know, you could also take the same parallel and say, well, you know, I really need to work on my X muscle group. So I'm going to, you know, have more periods of specializing on my delts. I don't know, whatever it is. And if you don't have a competition on the line as a powerlifter where you're trying to peak all three lifts, the most applicable strategy is probably to cycle through the different movement patterns, focus on your weaknesses like Dr. Z just brought up. And that kind of gives you some concept of what a quote-unquote holding pattern, not say holding as maintenance, but what a non-meat specific training looks like, cycling in the different lifts and emphasizing your weak points and bringing them up, and then having the cyclical pattern of putting some things on maintenance and progressing others. That might be what most of your training looks like for someone who's a strength enthusiast per se, or a power lifter who is not necessarily targeting a specific meet. So I think that's really helpful. I appreciate that.
Can I interrupt with some breaking news?
Break our news.
Somebody's out there has to care about this. I just see my phone light up, and it's a text message from my dad, and he just says Gronk to Tampa. Rob Gronkowski apparently just came out of retirement and is going to go play with the Bucks to play with Tom Brady. I realize Helms has no care level about this, but this is big news.
So what's amazing about this is live breaking news that by time it's posted will be old. But in the moment you can capture the live reaction, Eric, and that's a beautiful thing. I think. Yeah.
In fairness, Adam Schefter broke this news. Like not my dad to me and then me to Iron Culture, but nonetheless, this is exciting.
Mike Zourdos broke this news, and we're going to repay you in turn, my friend. Don't worry. What Eric and myself will probably do is take exactly what you said with that very specific example that was not applicable to any one particular person. We'll whip it up into some sort of template. We'll probably call it something nifty like the Zourdos method, kind of like the Shaco template.
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Eric, we know how this. We'll charge a price that denotes this individual is indeed a guru. So probably anywhere between what, Eric, $100 to $200.
Yeah, at least, and I'd probably end it in like a weird odd number, like 197 or something like that, to indicate that we've done some type of marketing plan.
Can you draw some shapes on the cover of it?
No, that would give it too much legitimacy. I think instead what we'll do is just find an old picture of you squatting 500 pounds.
Yeah.
And this would really go back to your previous business success where you leveraged DUP as a specific program and how it would solve all problems, body comp, life-related, strength.
I did. I really marketed that. Totally came out with a book. I thought it's cool though. Finally found a use for Eric's books. I want to teach my son shapes. This is great.
As we
Multi-use.
Yeah, as we learned on Iron Culture, Eric, I can't believe someone dared to correct us because we're talking 2D and they're talking 3D, where we said, as we know, a pyramid has 3 points, and they said actually has 5 points, and that person has since been assassinated. I think the last element, though, Mike, of the mystique that we want to build around you in that template that we will use, and not give you actual credit in the form of any monetary compensation, but superficially we'll say that we worked alongside Mike Z to develop this, will be some sort of, ethnic interesting illusion where we'll say like Mike, like what, he's Greek, it's like therefore it's like this is calling back to the Pantheon now, it's calling back to the original Olympics. This is not generation old, this is thousands of years old. The Spartans used this to defeat the Persians.
Secret Spartan
Greek trick. You've heard the
Yes.
Bulgarian method, so we'll probably call it the Zourdos Spartan method. I'm just spitballing here, guys.
I mean, that's great because Eric can just draw on his firsthand experiences during that time to help you.
Absolutely. I can tell you that this is indeed accurate. And I think, people responded well to, hey, this is a secret Russian method.
Yeah.
And it'll be like, Russia?
Yeah.
We're talking the Parthenon, dude. We're getting down. Like this is we're going back, way back.
Can I ask a question about kind of Bulgarian daily max training to Omar? Is that
Yeah, how terrible it felt? No, I'm joking. Yeah.
How did you get? Because I know for me, like how I got interested in it. How did you get? I am genuinely interested in how you got interested and came about it, and how you decided to undergo that. Because those that haven't done it, this is no easy feat. So I have a lot of respect for anybody that does that. How did it become of interest to you?
One, I'm a masochist, so I just thought, hey, what's like the worst program I could do that'll make me feel terrible? And I want to sign up. No, so I will give actually Sean Kelly, the owner of Forrest Fitness, credit. He is one of the people that in fact has super training. Mel Sif's book, Verkhoshansky, Abajev. He has a lot of books, and he is now in his 50s, 55 years old. He's a lifetime lifting enthusiast. He's one of the few that has taken the time to read it. And so he would
took most of those 50 years to read Super Training. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, he his hair went from black to now gray after reading it. He's like, and I still don't understand a thing. Like he's very transparent. I love it. But he was just speaking first because the first ever program, Mike, that I legitimately did when I joined Sean's gym, I just did the basic Ed Cohn Felipe program, which is just a linear periodization, like kind of peaking program. Ain't nothing fancy, right? And so I did that. I got great gains. And so Sean's like, hey, try this, try that. I went on, he is a Westside certified coach. I did try some Westside programming via him where it comes to the squat. It didn't work out great for me, but that's okay. And so I just kept kind of experimenting, and I kept my ear to the ground. And then around that time, actually, it was Jeremy Hamilton, the guy that went to our gym that broke the 220 weight class record. Well, I just told him around that time, when we speak about us being general enthusiasts, I was like, I built like a certain level of muscularity. It'd be cool to get stronger. It was still novel to me. The squat for me had always lagged behind. He had spoken to me how he tried this out, how he heard it. There's actually a guy, I'm going to butcher it, who went to Raw Unity, the meet that would occur every year, like the biggest meet basically before the IPF became a thing for untested lifters. So he laid out the framework, and then
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. And then around that time, then I got into contact. I shared one of Greg Knuckles' one of his articles, and so it was like kind of this happy thing merging together where I was already doing it. And I spoke with, and so I under the tutelage of Jeremy, and kind of he said like A, B, C, D, like do this, try this, the daily max, like, basically what we now call RPE, more like this is like 2014. And so then I got together with Greg because we just started talking. And then he's like, oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I've already been thinking about that. And then he's the one, obviously, Greg's the brains. It's like the Bulgarian method. Let's make something that's applicable to everyone. So that's kind of all the factors. I ran it. It went great. I hit the PR. It actually, I will be honest, because kind of what you said, the first thing Jeremy said is, hey, man, make sure everything else you're doing, it's on maintenance volume. You know what I mean? He wasn't like, so you're going to run the Bulgarian method for your squat, and then you're also going to do, whatever, small off junior when it comes to your bench. He's like, bring it down. So it actually felt all right. Like, you get a little achy, but it was a very fun experience, and I liked the planning behind it and kind of the focus where I was like, I got one goal, increase my squat, come in 4 times or 5 times a week, and we're going to be squatting. So yeah, man.
Dude, that's awesome. Did you enjoy it as miserable as it was? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, no, so I don't know if I'm Ben Escrow level, who we had on the supplement roundtable, where I forget, I don't want to misquote him, but where he said he did, there's some sort of program, Eric, he did that was like basically it sounded like the hardest program I've ever heard. Like put himself through hell.
I don't even know if I'd call what Ben and also Mike did back in the day programs. It was just like, I've heard volume's good, I've heard intensity's good, I've heard frequency's good. Let's do those. Yeah. So
Ben and I used to actually, we were talking about this before. Ben and I used to video train together every day. And we used an app, it was called Tango. So Ben and I used to tango together every day for a long time.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so I was doing daily max training on the squat.
Yep.
Then it got to a point where I was doing it twice a day. And Ben was maxing every day on the deadlift. And so I thought like, hey, this is pretty tough. I got to a point, I think it was about 140 days was about as far as I went with it. And I made really great progress every single day. And the last 40 or 50 were twice a day. I was made really great progress for like the first almost 100 days. And then I started going twice a day and that was a disaster. But Ben, I don't know, I don't think he went that whole time, but maybe for 2 months or so, he did it on the deadlift. And he got damn strong. He was deadlifting. I remember him hitting a couple 610s during that time. And he probably started at like 550 when he started that cycle, and he went up pretty high. But I thought it was miserable what I was doing, and then I just watched him, and I was like, this is another level. The coolest part about that was he used to have these old sweet chrome Ivanko plates, and like when I would watch his video, I was just like, I don't really know, man, but I just know that I wish I was lifting on those plates because those look really cool. But yeah, man, he did some pretty miserable training too.
No, I love, they're, as Eric and myself talk, they're essentially rites of passage, you know what I mean? It's not even necessarily the efficacy of the program so much as the belief and thus the adherence, and then kind of the war wounds or the feedback you get after that, you know what I mean? Like I joked when I said the West Side, I followed it to a T, what Sean said in the programming, and just for whatever reason, the combinations, it didn't work for me, you know? And so I moved on from there. I'm sure for other individuals where you said, once again, individual variability probably would have been great. But I'm like, that's a little feedback for me. Gotcha. All these variations, the conjugate method, doing belt squats and working up to 5 RM that basically is a RP11. I'm like, I don't know if that's for me, you know?
You just said rite of passage, and Eric earlier said, it's important, even if you could know it was suboptimal and you don't, perhaps you shouldn't change that because it's important to go through those times. And so I think that's really well said. I wholeheartedly agree. You tend to think of things from like a sports or a team sport background. That's my background and how I got into lifting. And you always hear, if you're a sports fan and you watch, they're always asking questions. First of all, questions from the media to athletes and coaches are typically the worst questions ever. Like, what are you going to do in the second half? We're going to I usually don't talk like this on podcasts, but forgive me, we're going to score more fucking points. Like, stop asking me, right? But they'll say like, well, sometimes do you think it's better to lose, so that way you can learn No, it's never better to lose. It's objectively never better to lose. But the answer to that should be, no, it's not better to lose. However, we understand that we inevitably will lose. And when we do lose, you're damn sure we're going to learn from it. And through those times, it's how you learn from that. What do you watch on film? What do you change about your mindset going into that game? How do you react to your teammate that may have had a poor play? Do you jump on him or her and really get after them for doing something wrong? Or, do you go talk with them and try to figure out what they need to get better for the next game and what you need to do, whether it's your play or as a leader or whatever it is to improve, or tactics. And so you never want to lose, but if you do lose, perhaps how you respond to that is what's going to make you successful in the long term. So when you do something in training that's wrong, how do you respond to that? Do you double down on it and you're not willing to change? Do you go through this cycle endlessly where you're doing okay, but you're never really making great progress and you just keep doing those same things? or do you make something work? I'm a big hockey fan, and if anybody out there is a big hockey fan, in 2018, the Washington Capitals finally won the Stanley Cup. They've been in existence since 1974, never won. Have Alex Ovechkin, one of the greatest goal scorers of all time. Every year they were maybe leading the league in points, but every year they lost in the second round of the playoffs. And Ovechkin finally, 32, 33 years old, he comes through and wins. And so I think about that. Every year, what did this guy do in the locker room when he was one of the best players in the league, leading the league in goals, and they lose to teams that are inferior to them every year? Well, they finally won. So he must have been dealing with that, and the team must have been dealing with that in the appropriate way. Because sometimes it just doesn't click, and you can't win, or you don't get the job done on meet day. But they must have dealt with that in the right way. So the two statements you guys used make me think of that. In training, you're going to make mistakes, especially as the enthusiast, or if you are a powerlifter bodybuilder. But how you deal with that, are you going to deal with it like someone that goes on and wins a championship or wins a Stanley Cup and comes back from that? Or are you going to, this wasn't my fault. This happened today. I got to go back. I got to just do this again, right? How are you going to deal with that? Not just tactically in your training, but mentally, how are you going to handle that? And I think that's really probably what makes a difference in a lot of people in the long run when they get into training. That's my ramblings there.
I think better than a rambling, that was a great kind of wrap up to what we've discussed. You gave some really practical advice for people with hypertrophy goals, bodybuilders, people with pure strength goals, also people with mixed goals. You helped us understand the differences between programming and periodization, and to have probably a better philosophical understanding of what we can and can't know, and the value, although not definitely not better, but the value in potentially making errors, and where we can go from that. So I just want to open the floor to you, Mike. Is there anything else you want to leave us with before we wrap this puppy up?
Not really. I just want to thank you guys for having me on. I do appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to talk to both of you. Other than that, you can follow me again at the Gardening Dietitian. I post. I don't know why the laughter, but you can post all the tips and tricks about gardening. What kind of soil you should use. You need to. Need to be able to follow the tips and tricks for baking as well. Sometimes I bake focaccia bread on there. Sometimes it's just regular white bread. Other times I bake some cakes. I'm working on my piping skills on cakes. So you can see it. You can see it there on the gram, as the kids call it. Let me know if you have any questions. Just post them up at the Gardening Dietitian, and I'm ready to answer. But otherwise, I think that's it, man.
You heard it here, folks. Please send all questions to @the Gardening Dietitian. That might as well be Mike Zourdos, and we'll definitely get back to him, even if it is not technically Mike Zourdos. So he will hear about your questions. No. Can't guarantee you'll get an answer or even a nice response, but I just want to say thank you, Mike, to being on. Lots of good wisdom. If you really do want to actually read more of Mike's stuff, you can always check out Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. We write about this stuff in all kinds of depth and fun every month. Omar, you want to close this out, my friend?
I got you. Yeah, and I think the best thing we could say is if you want answers, you're looking to answers from Mike, just look for your own answers. That's really what he was talking about this entire podcast. So don't look to him. Look inward. And just, think to yourself, it sets a 5, but whatever. We're not here to squabble at the end. I want to thank Mike for being on. We definitely I'm going to just say it out loud, have to get you back on much sooner. We're not going to wait an entire year. In fact, I think you said something about the second region for you that you're exploring right now, and you threw up so many technical phrases at once. I was like, wow, that sounds sexy. Like, I don't know what it's about, but I want to hear more about it, so we'll definitely get you back on. Those that are listening, speaking of sexy, we are in an eternal battle. And guys, I actually failed to send Eric, but I'm going to send him the screenshot. It's like sex with Dr. Jess or sex with Emily, and then it's Iron Culture. So we're waging a culture war right now, and you can help us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. Shout out to the latest review, which was 1 star. That's no joke. I appreciate you. Give whatever rating that you want on YouTube. If you leave a comment, we'll do our best to respond. And we're back every single Monday from now to eternity.